Hi, hello and welcome. This is Thinking is Engaging, providing LTELs access to learning that they deserve. My name is Brett Goslin, and I have about 15 years of collective experience working with English learners as an ESL teacher, instructional coach, and district administrator. And so hopefully I'll be able to bring some of that perspective today to talk about the discussion of LTELs. And I really am going to have to hold myself to some strict timing. Um, as this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I could talk about it for all days. So we're going to do a really cursory treatment of some of the important um, information about these students and their support, and really focus our attention on some practices. So as we dive in today, this is kind of what the session is going to look like. We will address what an LTEL is and kind of how that happens and how a student becomes an LTEL. We'll address what we see in their behavior and why we see those behaviors occurring in LTELs. That's one of the biggest challenges that teachers have to grapple with, is understanding some of the negative behaviors that the students that are in the situation bring and why they do that. And then with that understanding, then we're going to move the majority of our time into what that instruction should look like and how that needs to help these students identify as a successful learner, equip them with strategies for becoming an autonomous learner, and providing them lots of opportunities for thinking and solving in a supportive environment, and how these things coming together are what an LTEL finds engaging, and focusing our attention on that. So the first thing we want to address is, what is an LTEL and how did that happen? And we're going to do, like I said, a very cursory treatment of this, simply because it is a very big discussion. But what I've done here is pulled kind of a snapshot from some really seminal research by Dr. Lori Olson. The I guess the key title from her work is called Reparable Harm. If you're going to look at one resource first for understanding LTELs, I would definitely begin with this one. And so what she's done here is kind of captured what you'll see in a lot of the research about LTELs in a very small segment. I'm not going to read this. I just want to point out some of the key phrases that I've highlighted here, because it really brings some important themes to light as to why this occurs and why an English learner would become an LTEL. And so you'll see recurring throughout this little segment is that word program, no language development program, or the program wasn't designed to meet English language learners, or weak language development program, poorly implemented programs. So that's a key there, and we have to think about who is responsible for those programs. And then you come down to some really important information down here about narrowed curricula, partial access to the full curriculum, and that's kind of where that pobrecito syndrome hangs out. The whole well, you're an English learner and this is going to be hard, so we want to make sure that you're comfortable and that we build confidence, aka we're going to give you something easier to do. That's where that lives. And then we see even more significant contributions to this issue of social segregation and linguistic isolation. All these things collectively contribute primarily to an English learner becoming an LTEL. And what that really means is a student who's been in our programming for 6 or more years, beyond the point that they should be, really. They should have been moved on, exited the program, and moved past needing those scaffolds and supports, and they're still demonstrating that they do. And so this is a big key indicator as to why that happens. So with all that in mind, the takeaway from that is what does that really mean? So what that means is, basically, we as educators are the ones that are making LTELs. And then what we do is, when those students come to us as secondary learners, we kind of treat them like it's their fault. We see these negative behaviors that we talked about before. Things show up like being disconnected or disengaged, all the way to being defiant or acting out in class. And really, those are natural, normal responses to a really poor system that's kind of communicated some negative messages about who you are to you. So that's in essence what we've done. We've created the problem, and then we've turned it on the students and said, well, no, it's your fault because you're not motivated, or you're not behaving, or you're not turning in your work. This is also where that thought comes from. And if I hear somebody else say this, I'm going to lose my mind. Or your culture doesn't value education. I can't stand that one. or they don't have a good home life. They probably don't have parents that value education. None of these things are actually the case or true. It's really boils down to your educational experience has been subpar. Other students have had access to things that you haven't had access to because the focus of the conversation has been filling in your gaps, getting you caught up, putting you in remediation. We have to keep in mind that these learners are students that have been in every single boot camp, pullout, intervention, summer school since third grade, essentially. That's probably second grade was probably the last time that many of these students ever felt like a successful student. And here they are as middle school and high school learners with this deep educational baggage that they're carrying that is pretty negative. You have to think about if we're talking about middle school learners, for example, middle school is kind of a make it or break it year or few years. That's where really the success of high school and what kind of post-secondary options you have available to you start in middle school. That's where students begin taking early high school credits and start getting on the track to be able to be in the top 10% and have access to opportunities that if you think about what our LTELs experience when they showed non-success on a state assessment, what did they do to them in middle school? Well, they put them into remedial classes that denied them access to things like extra credits or electives that let them explore their interests and figure out things that they might like to pursue. All those things begin in middle school. And so as a result, we see this great divide happening programmatically between students who um, don't have the linguistic and programmatic background that LTELs do versus the ones that do, and the kind of opportunities that you see that are different between the two. So all that in a nutshell, like I said, I'm doing a very cursory treatment of this. We can go on for this research for days and days, but we want to get to what we can do about it. So the result of this situation that we want to spend the rest of our time talking about and addressing how we can do something about this is the self-concept that happens for a student that's been through an experience like this, when I've been over-intervened and everything about my education, the conversation has purely been filling in my gaps. What does that do to your psyche? It kind of communicates to kids, I'm not cut out for this. Obviously, if I had been successful, I wouldn't have to be taking all these remedial classes. I wouldn't have to be constantly fixing failing testing scores. I wouldn't be in a summer school that's trying to keep me from not going into a next grade level. Um, and when I'm in these kind of classes and I'm seeing the difference between what I'm getting and what other kids are getting and the fun that they seem to be having, it kind of makes me feel like I'm not that important. And that this just isn't really designed for me. I'm not really meant to be here. And then I start going into this mental process of when can I leave? When can I be done here? Because this is obviously not working out. And that's when we start seeing the conversation of dropout start to pop up. I've literally seen kids come into the office and ask if they can have dropout papers because they're done. Um, it's sad. So this is the result of the things that we have put on to students. And so what we need to do as educators is own the fact that it is our programming, and that if we're going to do something about it, we need to acknowledge that, own it, and then do the right thing moving forward and not project the problems that these kids encountered back onto the kids and make them feel as though you're broken or you're not good enough, it's your fault. And when in essence it hasn't been. Think about yourself in a situation where you're kind of receiving this message and people are treating you less than. How long could you go without being frustrated and showing signs of your frustration? That's really what we're seeing here with the behaviors that we have in our classrooms, and the disconnect that kids have when it comes to learning is just the normal response to being frustrated. So what we want to do is make you not frustrated. So that's what we're going to spend the bulk of our time discussing, is how do we make that shift. Many of us are not in situations where we're going to be able to completely turn the programming and the system on its heels and create this utopia. But what we can do is address the fact that the reality of the students that I'm getting now, what am I going to do about that right now? And so that's what we're going to focus our attention on, is what can I do right now? So the keys to change, the keys to helping the students that we've got in front of us make that shift and see themselves in a different life, change that self-concept, is really twofold. One, it's the educator mindset, and two, it's the practices that match. And so the mindset has to be one where I believe that you can succeed, and it's not because I I think that you need to be fixed, or we're going to fill in all your gaps, is because I genuinely believe that you already are strong enough, good enough, capable enough. I recognize your funds of knowledge. I see you in an asset-based approach rather than a deficit. I'm not talking about all your needs and your gaps. I'm talking about what you bring to the table, your character, your funds of knowledge, the strengths that you have, and with that, you have what it takes to be successful. And so that's the first step, is having that belief system, and then I'm going to pair it with practices that actually match. And that's where I see a lot of times is we don't have this second piece. We have a lot of I see a lot of educators that really care, and they really build that relational capacity with these students, and they're there for them, and they make a safe space, but we don't push them and challenge them with the practices that we have instructionally to move forward, and they just kind of stay there feeling safe, which is good and feels good, but it doesn't transform, it doesn't bring the transformative results that the student needs in order to have access to the opportunities that we want them to be able to have access to. So our practices need to hold students, yes, to high expectations, but they need to be paired with high support that leads to independence and not helplessness. And so what we're going to look at is how we can create an instructional environment that does that. And so the conversation here is really about our approaches and our holistic environment, rather than let's look at a bunch of different strategies. We all have access to lots of different strategies, activities, methods. There's all kinds of digital resources and things. And so that is, kind of individual, personal. You'll learn those things as you want to. But what we want to do is figure out, where do they go and how do you use them in the most appropriate way? And so that's what this conversation is going to be about. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through kind of a 4-stage process. This can be seen as like a lesson cycle, or maybe even a unit cycle. But what it does is really kind of define what the teacher's role is and what each stage of the learning is supposed to accomplish, so that an LTEL sitting in a classroom environment can learn alongside a non-EL peer and be not just successful, but really change their self-concept of, yes, I am a capable student. I've got strategies that can help me get unstuck like any other successful student does, and I have an environment where I can actually use them. And so that's what we're going to walk through here in just a moment. So to do that, we're going to use an example. I pulled a Common Core standards for Algebra 1 in essence, and we're just going to look at the basic concept of a function, its graphs, looking at the different formula equations for it, just basic algebra stuff. And so we're going to use that example for the context for what this might look like during instruction. And I like to use a math example because I think a lot of our support as EL people, I've learned this the hard way as an EL person. I have an English background, and I find that a lot of our support sounds very ELAR, and then we kind of say, oh, but if you're math, you'll just tweak it. So I like to go the extra mile, and for my math folks, this is for you. We're going to do math example. All right, so like I said, we're going to walk through what that kind of environment looks like and how I can start to finish create learning that supports thinking and supports independence for our LTELs. And the goal here isn't just that we're going to serve LTELs in isolation, but this is a holistic approach to the classroom so that all students are learning together at high levels, and learning these skills side by side. And we're not isolating or singling out students like we've learned they've already experienced. So the most successful way to begin learning a concept is to give the students time to play with it. Rather than jumping in and saying, okay, well, here's all the vocabulary you're going to see, or let's talk about what a function is, and start defining things right off the bat. All that is academic language that, for it to work and make sense, it has to have some context. It's got to be built around a conceptual understanding of the idea before I can start hearing and doing something with meaning with the word function. So what I've pulled here, this screenshot comes from a Khan Academy lesson, and it's actually, if you go to the website, it's interactive. And so what this is I'm not going to even say the word function. I'm just going to give you this link and say play. Okay, this scenario here, where we've got time and altitude working side by side, is a really good example of what we're going to be learning today. What I want you to do is just play with it. You've got up here a situation, and I want you to see if you can figure out the relationship between a mirror's altitude and to the sea level. and if you can kind of figure out with a scenario where you would put these points on this graph. There's no right or wrong. You don't need to feel like you have to get the right answer. I just kind of want you to play and see if you can figure this out. What I'm doing here is giving you a chance to think and recognizing you're intelligent. And if I give you a chance to make an observation, you probably would do a pretty good job. And if you don't come up with the right answer right away, it's okay. But what you are doing is making some really meaningful connections and making some really important discoveries and drawing some important conclusions that are going to help the vocabulary and the concepts that we're going to go into in just a minute make sense. So this is just the nature of this is just play. Get an idea for it, and then we'll talk about it and see what we came up with. But I want you to just have an opportunity to just make some observations and tell me what you think before we start diving into the nuts and bolts of this. So once that's been established and we have a conceptual grounding for this, and there's lots of different ways that you can do this. I just pulled one example. We want to move into where that the meat of the instruction comes in, where I do start to learn that nuts and bolts of the function and how it works and how it's graphed and all that good stuff. And so the difference between here and what we typically see in instruction is I'm not going to be the one that's going to directly tell you how to do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up learning to where you're going to use a resource and you're going to figure it out for yourself. And I'll give you structure. You know, if I'm going to point you, for example, to this Purple Math article that I pulled, I'll give you a structure. I'll give you a focus note taking document, for example. I'll tell you the 4 or 5 key ideas that you need to be able to define and explain. I might set it up to where you're going to have to give me a definition of this. You're going to have to explain, you know, it's in your own words. That's a key there. No copying. Explain it in your own words, and then write out an example. So I'll give you structure. But what I've done here is I've pulled resources that will teach this to you where I don't have to be the one that does that. And that does some really important things for me. That allows me to really be the facilitator we've been talking about recently in education rather than the sage on the stage. Because as everybody's working independently and learning for themselves and thinking for themselves, I am free to walk around the room and recognize where there's some struggle. And so I can quickly do some best practices and pull a small group and say, okay, you 3 here, I see we need some assistance, come sit with me and I'll walk you through this really quickly and get you up to speed with what you may be confused about. And then I'll send you back to continue on your own. The strategy that I'm kind of drawing from here is called is the use of a text set, which I've got, which is a resource that I have used repeatedly from a very good friend, Tan Huynh, who really outlines this very, very well in this link that I've shared right here about how to set up a text set and what that does. And I've kind of done one here for math. And so what I've done is pulled the same concept just from different modes of learning in different ways. So up here we have a very text heavy way to learn this. Some students might prefer to read it. I'm kind of that way. So that's what this Purple Math article does. I've got a lesson here that's got all kinds of different interactivity in it. And then I've also just got a YouTube video. And so I can structure this in different ways and say, okay, out of the 3, pick 2 that you want to utilize and complete your focus notes in your own words. Utilizing those, I can point you to just a specific one and say, okay, based on what I've seen from you, you probably would do best on this one. Go ahead and just learn off the Purple Math. However you want to structure that, but I'm setting things up to where you're learning for yourself, giving you the resources that you need, and helping you recognize that there's material out there that will help you learn. You just need to find it. And the planning for this isn't me planning what I'm going to say or my slides or how I'm going to present this. The planning is just finding the resources that are best quality and making them available to my students. So it actually reduces what I have to prepare for this, and just I put my attention into finding high quality materials so that I can spend my effort during class being supportive. Okay, so with that, the next stage is calibration. You were learning independently, so in order to make sure that we got what we were supposed to from that, we're going to calibrate. And this is peer-oriented, and this serves 2 really critical purposes for learning, especially for LTELs. One, it helps them. It's the processing. It's the summarizing. I just spent all this time researching, taking notes, studying. Now I need to process and make sense out of it. I'm going to do that with a peer, which means I'm going to be able to use the academic language that I just encountered for myself, which is what will really internalize it. So I'm doing those 2 key pieces simultaneously with this. So with that goal in mind of being able to calibrate and making sure we learn what we were supposed to learn, a good strategy, it's very simple, oldie but goodie, is the QSSA. And so that'll just give me structure so that when I have students turn and talk to one another about what they learned, that they have something to say and they know how to say it. And so if you're not familiar with this with the sequence, the Q stands for the question. I'll pose a question such as what is an effective way to graph a linear equation? So then the S is where the students will give me a signal when they are mentally prepared to answer the question. They don't need to talk, they don't need to write, they just need to mentally have an idea of what they want to say. Maybe it's a thumbs up. I'll look around the room and see if I see that. The next S is where I will give you a stem to form your answers. So an effective approach towards graphing linear equations is blank. What that does is two things. One, it points your thinking in the right direction so that you're actually answering the question I need you to answer. And two, it sets the stage for the tone of the academic language you need to use. I can also pair this with a word bank to ensure that you're utilizing the correct content-specific terms in your answer so that it's really, really strong and that you have the opportunity to internalize that really important academic language that makes this make sense. And then the last S is sharing. And so that's when you would have them turn to and talk to their partner. Maybe have an A partner go first, followed by a B partner. And you can pair that with after you're done talking, evaluate your responses and see if there was any differences. And if there was a difference between your response, determine if it's A, just because you're saying the same thing but in a different way, or is it B, because one person may not be all the way correct. And if that's the case, get correct. Work together to figure out what the issue is, and then come to an agreement on what the correct response should be. If it's a response that does have a right or wrong. And then the A is assess, where now I'm free to really call on any student that I want to because you've been so supported with the first 4 steps that really any student in the room should be able to hear their name called and answer this question after having had a chance to think about it, write about it, talk about it. I should be able to share about it to the class. And I can use this assess to make sure we again calibrate. All right, students, this student A over here, they responded this way. It was an excellent answer. Verify that what you wrote in your notes matches that because that's what you should walk away with. So all of this works together to ensure that we're collectively and collaboratively utilizing language to make sure that we got what we were supposed to out of our independent learning. And then finally, now we can start assessing. Oops, clicked the wrong direction. It happens. All right, so our assessment. And this is where our independent practice, our exit tickets hang out. And we can do that now more effectively, knowing that our students have been supported along the way to be able to respond to these things appropriately. I can give you these practice problems, and you are probably going to be a lot more successful now. When we go to the exit ticket, I can go into that with some reasonable certainty that you're going to give me something that matches the objective that we had for the day. When we do that exit ticket, my strong recommendation is that you make your exit tickets every day a written response. And that isn't just purely for the development of language. It's also the real reason why that's so critical is it allows students the chance to summarize and make sense of what they did and why they did it. If that's the question that you ask every day is, what did we learn and why was it important? And they write that in response with a word bank from the vocabulary that they learned today, oh my gosh, your kids are going to be golden. And you don't have to change a thing. That can be the same question every single day. But the key is that it actually has to happen. And that's one of the things that we'll let go by the wayside as time starts to run out is, oh, okay, well, we don't have time for exit ticket. Make time for the exit ticket. It's really, really critical that students have the opportunity to think and process one last time and connect the significance of what they learned to what they learned yesterday and what they think they're going to learn tomorrow. Things like that are going to go a long way in the retention of what you're teaching your students. All right, so in a quick nutshell, and I know that I was speaking fast. Like I said, there's a lot I could say, but I want to try to make sure that I honor the time that these sessions deserve. But in a nutshell, what we've really addressed is, like I said, those two keys to success: having the mindset and the practices that match, so that our LTELs have the kind of learning that they deserve in order to see themselves the way that they deserve to see themselves as successful students who are capable of achieving anything that they want to achieve. And that when they come to the conversation of post-secondary options, that they're able to make decisions based off of an informed perspective with the skill set in mind, that if they turn something down, it's because they legitimately can turn it down, not because it's not available to them. And so really, it boils down to one, having a heart that believes that yes, you have what it takes and we're going to get you there. And two, have practices that transform and that match that belief by giving students the opportunity to think for themselves, learn for themselves, use strategies to get unstuck, and start seeing themselves as successful, effective, independent learners. So with that, thank you for your time in watching this video. I really appreciate your attentiveness. Here's some of the resources that were used to reference today's material. If you're interested in looking at any of these, like I said, if you want to get started, I would highly recommend diving into reparable harm. That's really going to give you a lot in a pretty concise document. But with that, again, thank you. And I appreciate your time, and I would invite you to explore all the other learning that you'll find in ML Summit. It's an incredible resource and an incredible way to support teachers. So thank you all.